Rents in New York City are at an all-time high. In June 2022, citywide median asking rent reached $3,500. That's about a 35% increase from 2021.
The stark reality of New York's housing market hits hardest when you look at the numbers. Earning $100,000 a year, what many would consider a solid income, won't even qualify you for an average rental apartment in today's NYC. After paying $3,400 for a typical apartment, residents are left scraping by for basic necessities. Even supposedly affordable one-bedroom units command $2,000 monthly, far beyond what average New Yorkers can manage. I've watched families in my neighborhood pack up and leave, unable to keep up with these astronomical costs. Just last month, my neighbor Sarah, a teacher making $65,000 annually, had to move back in with her parents in New Jersey. Her story isn't unique. It's becoming the norm for middle-class professionals who once thrived here. The gap between income and housing costs has created a city where only the very wealthy can live comfortably, while everyone else struggles to keep a roof over their heads. This isn't just about numbers on paper. It's about real people being priced out of their homes.
That found that median rents in New York City rose 18% between 2019 and 2023. During that same period, incomes only grew by just over 11%.
The affordability crisis gripping New York City has reached alarming levels, with rent increases vastly outpacing income growth. Over the past 5 years, while rents have shot up by 18%, New Yorkers' paychecks have only grown by 11%. This widening gap is forcing painful choices on residents who've called this city home for generations. Walking through any neighborhood grocery store tells the real story of this crisis. Basic items that were once affordable now feel like luxury purchases. A gallon of milk that cost $3.50 in 2020 now sits at nearly $6. Fresh produce prices have jumped so high that many families are switching to cheaper, less healthy alternatives. Since 2020, grocery prices have skyrocketed by 25%, turning weekly shopping trips into budget-breaking ordeals. The city's new congestion pricing policy has added fuel to this financial fire. When delivery trucks have to pay extra fees to enter Manhattan, those costs get passed straight to consumers. A local shop owner told me his suppliers have already warned him about price increases. Every truck that brings me goods now costs more. I either raise my prices or close my doors. There's no other choice. These rising costs create a brutal cycle. Families cut back on groceries to afford rent, then face higher food prices when they shop, forcing them to stretch their budgets even thinner. The city's attempts at progressive policies haven't addressed these fundamental issues. Instead, regulations like congestion pricing have made daily life more expensive for average New Yorkers. As residents struggle with these soaring food costs, they're also getting hit with another financial burden that's making their situation even more desperate: utility bills that seem to climb higher every month. The combination of these rising expenses is pushing many New Yorkers to their breaking point.
Tonight, a lot of New Yorkers demanding to know what's going on with Con Ed. They say their latest electric bills have skyrocketed without warning.
In some cases, people were billed almost triple of what they paid back in December.
The utility crisis hitting New York residents feels like a perfect storm of bad timing and worse policies. Gas prices have shot through the roof, hitting hardest in older apartments where gas heating is the only option. In pre-war buildings across Queens, heating bills have jumped from $200 to over $350 per month, nearly doubling in just one winter. The city's new congestion pricing law has made this situation even more dire. Those big tanker trucks bringing gas into the city, they're now paying hefty fees just to cross into Manhattan. Truck drivers report paying $75 extra per delivery. That cost has to go somewhere, and it's not coming out of the company's pocket. Those fees get passed down the line until they reach people's utility bills. Basic services that New Yorkers once took for granted are becoming luxury items. The average electric bill has climbed by 32% since 2021. Water rates keep creeping up too, with the city approving a 9% increase just last year. These aren't optional expenses. You can't just decide not to heat your home during a New York winter or go without electricity. For families already stretched thin by sky-high rents, these utility increases hit like a sledgehammer. In the Bronx, many families report paying over $400 monthly for utilities in 2-bedroom apartments. Residents keep their heat at 62 degrees and wear sweaters inside, but the bills keep climbing higher anyway. The worst part? This might just be the beginning. Industry experts predict another 15% increase in utility costs over the next year, driven by infrastructure upgrades and rising fuel costs. These essential services are becoming a major factor in pushing people out of their homes, creating a desperate situation that's forcing many to seek unusual solutions, including a controversial housing law that's changing the face of New York's neighborhoods.
Well, New York City reaching a settlement over its attempt to roll back parts of the right to shelter law.
All right, it will give the city more flexibility over how long migrant adults can remain in shelters.
New York's right to shelter law, which once seemed like a compassionate solution to homelessness, has created an unexpected crisis in the housing market. The law requires the city to provide emergency shelter to anyone who requests it. A noble goal that's had some surprising consequences. With this mandate in place, city officials are now scrambling to find housing solutions, leading to some questionable decisions. They're converting abandoned hotels, college dorms, and even student housing into temporary shelters. But here's where things get interesting. Wealthy developers are being offered lucrative deals to build affordable housing apartments, only to have these same buildings converted into migrant shelters before they ever hit the rental market. The math is almost too good for developers to pass up. First, they receive tax breaks to construct these buildings under the promise of creating affordable housing. Then, they get additional state funding to transform these same properties into shelters. It's a double dip that's making some people very rich while doing nothing to solve the actual housing crisis. What's particularly frustrating is watching perfectly good apartments sit empty because they've been earmarked for potential shelter use. Buildings that could house working families are instead held in limbo, waiting to be converted. The irony is painful. In a city desperate for affordable housing, we're actually reducing the available rental stock. The real kicker? Many of these affordable units weren't truly affordable in the first place. When developers set rents at $2,000 or more for a 1-bedroom apartment, they're already out of reach for most New Yorkers. So when the government steps in to convert these units to shelters, they're solving one problem while perpetuating another. As these housing policies continue to reshape our neighborhoods, they're creating new challenges for construction in an already complex urban environment. Building new homes in New York isn't just about finding space.
Tonight, shocking new surveillance footage showing the moment a Bronx apartment building partially collapses. Another angle showing people run for safety as debris and dust cascades onto the ground below.
Building new housing in New York City isn't as simple as just finding an empty lot and starting construction. The city's aging infrastructure creates a complex web of challenges that developers must navigate. Beneath the bustling streets lies a century-old network of pipes, cables, and tunnels that can turn any construction project into a high-stakes gamble. The reality of new construction became painfully clear last year when a building project in Brooklyn had to halt after cracks appeared in 3 neighboring buildings. The vibrations from foundation work had threatened the structural integrity of these historic properties, some dating back to the 1800s. The price tag for reinforcing these adjacent buildings? An eye-watering $2 million, costs that eventually get passed on to future tenants. Even when construction does move forward, the challenges multiply. Most available lots sit on poor soil conditions, requiring expensive foundation work. Engineers regularly discover unmapped utility lines that need to be relocated, adding months of delays and millions in unexpected costs. In Manhattan, nearly 60% of new construction projects run into these underground surprises. The solution seems obvious. Build, 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 a mantra repeated by housing advocates. But this approach faces fierce resistance from various corners. Neighborhood groups worry about damage to existing buildings. Environmental advocates raise concerns about the carbon footprint of new construction. And some progressive leaders argue that new development only serves luxury interests despite the desperate need for more housing at all price points. The city finds itself caught in a frustrating paradox. We need more housing to solve the affordability crisis, but building that housing comes with risks that make it increasingly expensive. A recent development in Queens spent an additional $3 million just protecting neighboring structures, costs that pushed one-bedroom apartment prices from affordable to luxury territory. While the construction industry grapples with these physical challenges, city leaders seem more focused on implementing policies that many argue miss the mark entirely. Their approach to the housing crisis raises serious questions about whether they truly understand what average New Yorkers need to keep a roof over their heads.
Under this plan, the MTA will implement a congestion pricing plan with a reduced daytime toll of $9 beginning in January.
City leaders seem more interested in implementing headline-grabbing policies than addressing the real housing crisis facing everyday New Yorkers. Take the new congestion pricing plan. While it might reduce traffic, it's already driving up costs for everything from groceries to building materials. Meanwhile, basic solutions like streamlining building permits or revising outdated zoning laws sit untouched on bureaucrats' desks. The disconnect between policy and reality becomes clear when you look at recent initiatives. While middle-class families struggle to afford their apartments, the city spends millions on programs that don't address the core issue of housing affordability. Instead of focusing on creating more affordable housing units, they're implementing policies like banning cars from certain streets or reducing police funding, neither of which helps families keep their homes. Recent proposals from City Hall suggest this pattern isn't changing. Plans for higher utility taxes and increased property assessments are in the works, which will inevitably lead to higher rents as landlords pass these costs to tenants. It's as if officials are playing a game of Jenga with the city's housing market, pulling out support pieces while hoping the whole structure doesn't collapse. The focus on emergency shelters for migrants, while important from a humanitarian perspective, has overshadowed the growing crisis among long-term residents. City data shows that 75% of available housing funds are now directed toward emergency shelter solutions rather than affordable housing development. This shift has left middle-class New Yorkers feeling abandoned by their elected officials. In community board meetings across the city, residents voice their frustrations to seemingly deaf ears. "We've lived here for 30 years, one Queens resident recently testified, but it feels like nobody in power cares if we can stay." The city's response? Another task force, another study, another delay in meaningful action. As middle-class New Yorkers watch their rent consume an ever larger portion of their paychecks, many are starting to face an uncomfortable question. How much longer can they hold on before they're forced to join the growing ranks of the city's homeless population?
Do you think it's too expensive to live in New York City?
Yes, absolutely.
Of course, 100%.
With rising costs pushing New Yorkers to their financial limits, homelessness is no longer a distant threat, but a growing reality for middle-class residents. When an elementary school teacher making $55,000 annually can't afford a studio apartment, we're witnessing the collapse of what was once the backbone of New York City. It's middle class. The numbers paint a grim picture of this new reality. A shocking 40% of New York renters now spend over half their income on housing. That leaves barely enough for food, let alone savings for emergencies. One missed paycheck, one medical bill, or one rent increase can tip the balance from stable housing to homelessness. The options for struggling residents have become increasingly limited. Many are forced to choose between three equally difficult paths. The first involves cramming multiple families into apartments designed for single households, a practice that's both unsafe and often violates housing codes. In parts of Queens, it's common to find three families sharing a two-bedroom apartment with living rooms converted to makeshift bedrooms. The second option, leaving New York entirely, means abandoning careers, support networks, and sometimes even family members. Teachers, nurses, and other essential workers are increasingly joining this exodus, creating a brain drain that threatens the city's basic services. These departures create a ripple effect. As experienced professionals leave, the quality of city services declines, making life harder for those who remain. For those who can't or won't take either of these options, the third path leads to homelessness. The city's shelters are seeing a new kind of resident, former middle-class professionals who never imagined they'd need emergency housing. Recent data shows a 30% increase in shelter applications from individuals who were employed full-time in the previous year. This crisis raises a crucial question that city leaders seem reluctant to address. In a city that's becoming increasingly unaffordable, is there any real solution to prevent more middle-class New Yorkers from falling into homelessness? The answer might lie in some fundamental changes to how the city approaches housing development and affordability.
There are so many New Yorkers here and in other boroughs who spend their day in a vicious cycle, going to work and then trying unsuccessfully to look for an affordable apartment. A new report showing that search is now harder than it's ever been.
Solving New York's housing crisis requires a complete overhaul of current policies and a return to common sense solutions. The first step is fixing the broken tax break system that rewards developers for building affordable housing that ends up as shelters. These incentives need to directly benefit middle-class residents, not just pad developers' profits. The evidence from other major cities shows this crisis isn't inevitable. Cities like Houston and Miami have managed to keep housing somewhat affordable while growing their populations. They've done this through streamlined building permits, flexible zoning laws, and incentives that actually create affordable housing instead of just promising it. A key part of any solution must involve rewriting the rules around emergency housing. While the right to shelter is important, the current system creates perverse incentives. Building owners can make more money converting their properties to shelters than renting to working families. This needs to change. Tax breaks should prioritize long-term affordable housing over temporary solutions. Looking at successful models from other cities, New York could implement a middle-class first policy for new developments. This would require a certain percentage of units to be permanently reserved for middle-income residents at reasonable rents. Not the current affordable rates of $2,000 for a one-bedroom, but truly affordable rates based on average salaries. Voting patterns suggest New Yorkers are ready for change. Recent local elections show growing frustration with leaders who focus on symbolic gestures rather than practical solutions. Other major cities facing similar pressures have elected officials who prioritize housing affordability and have seen positive results. The path forward requires tough choices and honest conversations about what kind of city New York wants to be. Will it remain a diverse metropolis where teachers, nurses, and office workers can afford to live? Or will it become a tale of two cities, one for the very wealthy and another for those in subsidized housing with no room for anyone in between? The answer lies not just in new policies, but in whether New Yorkers will demand leaders who understand that a city without a middle class isn't really a city at all.